If your voice stops echoing, cancel your road trip. I am not saddened by the recent passing of my grandfather. Rather, I'm compelled to share the way I knew him best. I would not be here today if not for him. The entity came for me when I was 8 years old, and there was no way I would have survived if anyone else had been driving. My grandfather and I were on a fishing trip that day. Dad had intended to join us, but something had come up, so it was just the two of us for the first time. I was a little awkward around my grandfather because I had never actually been alone with him. I'd always watch others interact with him, but had very little to say myself because I was only 8. I was always in awe of how he was my dad the way my dad was to me, a voice of authority. When my grandfather told me about the different types of fish and what bait to use, I listened like it was the most important thing in the world. It turned out to be a good thing that I took his words so seriously. That acceptance would later save my life. It began very innocuously. We walked through a small gorge to get to the car from the prime fishing spot. I could hear my grandfather's voice echo from the high rock walls. When he packed things into the car, I had several minutes to wander around, and I used them to run back to the area and shout. Strangely, my yell echoed only feebly once, then not at all. Scream as I might, I heard no reflection of the sound. I was too young at the time to understand how impossible that was. I just assumed I was yelling wrong somehow, or that my grandfather had some super grown-up timbre that allowed his voice to echo while mine just dropped off. Still, it bothered me, and I eventually brought it up in the car on the drive back. Everything in that moment became seared in my memory. It was 3:22 in the afternoon by the clock on the car's dashboard. The sky was mostly clear with traces of white, and my grandfather's eyes were white orbs of alarm turned upon me while his white knuckles tightened around the wheel. "What did you say, boy?" "I asked how I could echo like you," I told him, suddenly afraid that I had done something wrong. "I yelled and I couldn't echo." His voice was normally crisscrossed with the little lines that ran their way along relaxed, droopy skin. At that moment, his forehead and cheeks tightened to smoothness, and he scanned left and right rapidly. He didn't seem to find what he was looking for through the windows, but he didn't seem reassured. "Here." He leaned over and opened a glove box in front of me to pull out a bag of jelly beans. I smiled for a moment, but he wasn't giving me them as a gift the way he had intended. "Eat them all." I held the bag in my hands. It seemed an impossible feat. If I had been left to my own devices, I might have eaten them all eventually, but not in one go. "Why?" "Eat them all, boy," he said gruffly, his tone brocking no argument. I began stuffing the jelly beans in my mouth. He looked down and around, and then at the back seat, then at his travel thermos in the cup holder between us. He thrusted it into my hands to join the spilling bag of jelly beans. "Drink this, all of it." "I'm not allowed to have coffee," I told him. "Mom," he cut me off. "Your mother will understand. Drink it. I know it tastes bad, but down it all." His gaze refocused on something beyond me, and I turned my head to the window to see the forested hills rolling by at various apparent speeds based on their distance. The furthest hill out on the horizon hardly seemed to move at all, though I thought I spotted a small speck atop it. My grandfather gripped my shoulder with one hand. "Drink, boy, drink, and eat those jelly beans. You need the sugar and the caffeine. It's going to try to make you fall asleep. Don't let it." To say I was scared was an understatement. No part of me thought that this was some prank of some sort. He was too reserved and austere a man for that. The coffee tasted horrible, but I gulped it down until nothing was left. After that, I began swallowing jelly beans whole until they were all gone. I looked to my right. The speck in the distance was still out there, but now one range of hills closer. It was still tiny, but now held movement akin to something waving back and forth. I looked at my grandfather in asking. He, in turn, looked away from the thing in the distance to focus on my face. He breathed in through his nose and turned forward, determined in a way I had never seen him. His legs moved. The car began to accelerate. We had already been going the speed limit on an empty highway. The sugar and caffeine and fear began to have their effect on me. I felt my cheeks and forehead warming and my hands growing clammy. I asked, "What's going on? I'm scared."
be scared, he breathed, his eyes on the road as he continued to hit the gas. I could see the needle pushing 80. That'll keep you awake, this thing, this godforsaken thing. It came for your grandmother, and it started the same way. Just before a long road, we noticed her voice stopped echoing. His face contorted into a fierce mask. But the cars are a lot better now than they were back then. I won't let it get you. My back began forcefully pressed into my seat as he put the gas to the floor. I watched the needle pass 90, and then I looked out the window again. It was even closer, now visible as the silhouette of a man running up hills, between trees, and over boulders parallel to us. It's still out there! My grandfather grunted angrily and audibly slammed his foot down. I held onto my armrest and the door handle in terror as our car topped 100 miles an hour and began to shake. It felt like we were a barely controlled projectile, far beyond any limit of safety. I was terrified the highway would suddenly stop being empty and we would smash into a car or a truck ahead. And even though the overwhelming fear and adrenaline, a chill tiredness began to seep up my spine. My eyes began to feel heavy, and I briskly looked to my right. The shock woke me back up. It was on the gravel shoulder of the road now, completely visible as a black humanoid silhouette running at incredible speed alongside our car. In the moving pitch darkness, I could see lit pinpoints that made it feel as if I was glancing at the night sky itself. The afternoon sun burned in the sky above, and behind it there was no effect. I stared as its blurred feet began to pedal across the painted line at the edge of the road. I felt sleepy again. It was running parallel to us, but drawing ever closer. Wake up! My grandfather shouted, risking one hand off the wheel at 110 miles an hour to shake my shoulder. It's trying to drain the life out of you! Wake up! He jerked the car one lane to the left, and still pressed into my seat by the acceleration, I stared down at the hypnotic dashes in the middle of the road. Bit by bit, black feet began landing between each dash, keeping pace with us. I remember the car shaking violently around us, the way I imagined the space shuttle lifts off might around astronauts. I know now that we were crossing 120 and nearing the most the car could offer, but at the time, I was caught in watching the hypnotic dashes in the stars in those void legs moving rapidly back and forth as it ran right up beside our car and reached down one hand to open the door. Wind blasted around me as a gale of force of 120 miles per hour winds tore at my clothing and hair. Waking up halfway, I screamed, and my grandfather jerked the car to the left more, as much as he could without going off-road. It didn't matter. The running silhouette held the door open against the wind as its star-filled arm began preparing to leap into the car with us. The other arm gripped my neck. The cold that it brought could not be described in mere words. The closest I could say is that the vast speed and forces of the antithesis cosmos hated me. Somewhere, ice and anti-life were rule, moving through emptiness at abrupt velocities, and this thing was just a small piece of that undead will. But it was not fully here. It could only interact with us in certain windows. That's what I believe now. My grandfather gave the only shout of fear I had ever heard from him as the car seemed to shake apart around us. I looked left at the speedometer and found the needle was unreadable far out into the red. I felt the heavy blanket of sleep fall over me as the silhouette grasped repeatedly but failed to reach me. The door slammed shut, cutting off the wind. Inch by inch, we began pulling away. It ran fiercely beside, but the entity was just a little bit too slow. Between one moment and the next, realizing it couldn't get us, it vanished. We escaped it. I woke up in the hospital several days later. My grandfather told no one the real story, of course. The doctors had plenty of diversions. Somehow, I had been drained of a number of vital electrolytes and salts, and so they had chalked my coma up to some sort of severe dietary imbalance. But I knew the truth. I've made sure to tell people I care about the little piece of advice that my grandfather taught me. I don't care if it makes sense to you. Just listen. It's out there, still in the open lands of the Midwest, and it's probably always been there. It just wasn't a problem before we started bringing great speeds into our life. People die every day by falling asleep at the wheel, and I know for certain that not all of those incidents are innocent.
If your voice stops echoing, cancel your road trip. It's waiting for you. And that was If Your Voice Stops Echoing, Cancel Your Road Trip.